The air in the auction hall was thick with tension as Sophie Carter sat in the back, her small hands clutching her father's worn leather wallet. The hall was buzzing with murmurs, and the clinking sound of coins being exchanged echoed in the background. It had been a year since her father, the renowned service dog trainer, had passed away. A year since Sophie had felt a part of her world crumble into dust. Her mother, Sarah, sat beside her, fidgeting nervously. The auction was the first time Sophie had ever been back to this place, the place that had been home to so many memories with her father.
Are you sure you want to be here, Sophie?
Sarah asked, her voice laced with concern as she glanced at her daughter. Her eyes were tired, heavy with the weight of the last year. I know it's been hard, but there's no need to force yourself into this. Sophie turned to her mother, her small face etched with determination. I need to be here, Mom. Dad would want me to be. I can feel it. Sarah sighed, running a hand through her hair. It's just that you've been through so much. You don't need to carry this burden alone. But Sophie was already focused on the stage where several dogs were being paraded in front of the crowd. She ignored the pang in her heart, the void that had only grown since her father's death. The crowd's interest was piqued by a particular dog, a German shepherd, weak and shaking. His fur was matted, his body slumped, and his eyes seemed to carry a sadness far beyond what any dog should know. The auctioneer, a tall man in a crisp suit, waved a hand toward the dog. Ladies and gentlemen, we have here a German shepherd, approximately 3 years old. He's trained as a service dog but has been through some rough patches. Medical condition makes him a less than ideal candidate for further training. He smiled awkwardly, clearly trying to mask the awkwardness of his statement. Starting bid is $50. The crowd murmured, a few glancing at each other, clearly uninterested. Sophie, however, felt something stir inside her chest. The dog's sad, tired eyes locked onto hers across the room. The connection was immediate, deep, and almost unnatural. It was as if the dog was calling out to her, pleading for help. She knew she couldn't leave him behind, not like this. Mom, Sophie whispered, her voice trembling slightly. I want him. Sarah looked at her daughter, a frown creasing her forehead. Sophie, he's sick. He's been through, who knows what. He might never recover. But Sophie shook her head. She couldn't explain it, but she knew. Please, Mom. I need him. He's like me. He's broken, just like me. Please. Sarah glanced around the hall, hesitating. She could see the desperation in Sophie's eyes. She knew how much the loss of her father had affected her, and she could also see the glimmer of hope that shone in Sophie's gaze. All right, but only if you use your savings.
This is your decision, Sophie.
Sophie nodded, a mixture of determination and anxiety in her heart. As she pulled out her father's wallet, she felt the weight of the decision settle over her. She had saved for this moment for years, ever since her father had first taught her how to train dogs. Sophie raised her hand. I'll bid $50. The auctioneer, looking slightly surprised, nodded. $50, anyone for $60? The room was silent.
No one else raised a hand.
Sold. To the young lady in the back, the auctioneer said with a smile. Sophie could feel the crowd's eyes on her, but she didn't care. She had made her decision. The moment she stepped forward to collect Shadow, the German shepherd's eyes met hers again, this time with an undeniable sense of recognition. Sophie reached out to touch his matted fur, and the dog, though weak, slowly pressed his head against her hand.
Good boy, Sophie whispered, tears welling up in her eyes.
Just as she led him away, her mother hesitated behind her. Sophie, are you sure about this? She asked softly. But before Sophie could answer, a shadow fell over them. A man dressed in dark clothes stood in the back of the room, his eyes fixed intently on Sophie and Shadow. He looked out of place. His gaze was unerringly focused on the dog, then quickly flicked back to Sophie, as if calculating something in his mind. Sophie felt a chill run down her spine but shook it off. She had enough to worry about with Shadow. Still, that man's eyes kept lingering in her mind as they left the auction hall. As Sophie and Shadow made their way to the exit, she felt an overwhelming sense of both excitement and dread. This dog, this mysterious, sick German shepherd, was hers now. And with him came not only the promise of healing but the looming question, why had he been abandoned? Why had no one else wanted him? Sophie didn't have the answers yet. But as she looked down at Shadow's tired eyes, she knew one thing for sure: she would find out. And what she would discover would change her life forever. The drive back home was quiet, the only sound being the low rumble of the car's engine and the occasional soft whimper from Shadow. Sophie sat in the back seat, her hands resting gently on the dog's trembling body. She kept glancing at him through the rearview mirror, her heart swelling with a sense of both responsibility and something deeper, something she couldn't quite explain. She had always felt a connection with animals, but with Shadow, it felt as though they were linked by something far more powerful than mere instinct. "Sophie, we need to talk about this," Sarah said softly, breaking the silence. She kept her eyes on the road, but her concern was clear.
I know you miss your father.
"I miss him too. But adopting a dog like this, he's been through a lot. We don't know what kind of baggage he carries." Sophie turned her gaze to the window, watching the landscape blur past. "I know, Mom. But I couldn't leave him there. He was just so alone. He needed me, and I needed him." Sarah sighed, her voice thick with emotion. "I just don't want you to get hurt. This dog, he's been rejected twice already, Sophie. Maybe there's a reason for that." Sophie's heart sank at her mother's words, but she refused to let the doubt take hold. "He's not broken, Mom. He's just been hurt. I can fix him. I know I can." They arrived at their modest house on the outskirts of Asheville, the home Sophie had shared with her father before he passed. The place was full of memories, some painful, others bittersweet. Sophie had always found comfort in the familiar scent of the old barn where her father had trained dogs. Now, it felt like both a sanctuary and a reminder of everything she had lost. Sophie gently helped Shadow out of the car and led him into the barn. She set up a small bed for him in the corner and filled a bowl with water. Shadow drank eagerly, his eyes still wary but beginning to trust Sophie's presence. She knelt down beside him, her hand running through his fur as she spoke softly. "You're going to be okay, Shadow," Sophie whispered. "I promise." The next few days were filled with a routine of care, but Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Shadow wasn't just weak, he was different. There was an intensity to his eyes, a sharpness that belied his frail appearance. She noticed that he would often stare at the door, as if waiting for something, or someone. And sometimes at night, Sophie would hear him growling softly in his sleep, his muscles tense, as if he were reliving something in his dreams. One afternoon, Sophie's curiosity got the better of her. She ventured into the small study that had belonged to her father, now filled with dusty notebooks and old training manuals. She flipped through the pages, her fingers skimming over the familiar notes her father had made during his years of training service dogs. That's when she found it. A faded document caught her eye, tucked behind a stack of papers. It was a medical file, dated several years earlier, with the name Shadow written at the top. The file was incomplete, with large sections blacked out. Sophie squinted, trying to make sense of the few details she could read. Shadow had been part of an advanced program designed to train dogs to detect seizures. But the report mentioned complications, followed by a vague reference to an experimental drug that had been used in the training. The rest of the file was completely redacted.
What is this?
Sophie whispered to herself, her heart pounding. She had a bad feeling, but she couldn't stop herself from reading more. She knew that the answers she was looking for were hidden somewhere in those blacked-out sections. Later that evening, Sophie's unease grew when she noticed a figure lurking in the distance outside their home. A man stood by the fence, watching them. His posture was stiff, his hands tucked into his pockets, but his eyes never left the barn. Sophie froze, her breath catching in her throat. It was the same man from the auction. She quickly ducked behind a nearby tree, her heart racing. She didn't want to be seen. Shadow, sensing her anxiety, let out a low growl from inside the barn. "What is he doing here?" Sophie muttered under her breath. The man didn't move. He just stood there watching. Sophie waited for what felt like an eternity, but the man eventually turned and walked away, disappearing into the woods. The next morning, Sophie was walking Shadow when they ran into Mrs. Grayson, their elderly neighbor. Mrs. Grayson had always been kind to Sophie, but today there was a nervous tension in the air. Her eyes flickered over to Shadow, then back to Sophie. "You don't know what you've gotten yourself into, child," Mrs. Grayson said, her voice low. "That dog, he's not just sick. There are people looking for him.
Dangerous people.
You'd better keep him close, and don't trust anyone who comes asking about him." Sophie blinked, stunned.
What do you mean?
Who's looking for him? Mrs. Grayson shook her head, her expression grim. I don't know the details, but I know enough to tell you to stay out of it. Trust me, Sophie, some things are better left alone. Before Sophie could respond, Mrs. Grayson turned and walked quickly back to her house, leaving Sophie standing there with a million questions swirling in her mind. That night, after Shadow had gone to sleep, Sophie sat in the barn, staring at the incomplete medical file. The unease she felt earlier had grown into something more, something deeper. She didn't know who the strange man was or what Mrs. Grayson had meant by her warning, but Sophie knew one thing for sure: whatever had happened to Shadow, whatever had been done to him, it was only the beginning. And Sophie would stop at nothing to uncover the truth. The unease Sophie had felt that night only grew over the next few days. She couldn't shake the image of the strange man from the auction, nor could she forget Mrs. Grayson's cryptic warning. Sophie spent hours in the barn with Shadow, researching everything she could about seizure alert dogs and Biogen Tech, the company her father had once mentioned in passing. She began to piece together fragments of information, but everything seemed shrouded in mystery. That night, as Sophie lay awake in bed, her thoughts kept circling back to the medical file. The file that held so many unanswered questions. She knew she had to dig deeper. But how? And what if someone was already watching? Sophie decided to visit the local library the next morning. Armed with her father's notebooks and the incomplete file, she began her research, poring over everything she could find about Biogen Tech and the experiments they had conducted. It was there that she found something that made her heart skip a beat. The old librarian, Mr. Daniels, who had known Sophie and her father for years, watched her as she sifted through the piles of research papers. "Looking for something, Sophie?" he asked, his voice low and kind. Sophie glanced up at him, her eyes wide with determination. "Biogen Tech," she said, barely able to contain her excitement. "Do you know anything about them?"
Anüting et al.
Mr. Daniels's face darkened slightly, and he hesitated before answering. "That name hasn't come up around here in years, but I do remember your father mentioning them once. He was always talking about some kind of program."
Sommeting experimental.
"I don't know the details, but it was never good news."
Sophies Pulse quickenet.
"I need to know everything."
Please, Mr. Daniels.
"I think Shadow's part of that program. His medical file. It's incomplete. There are sections blacked out." The librarian furrowed his brow and leaned in closer.
ID be careful, Sophie.
"Sometimes it's best not to know too much." But Sophie wasn't about to back down. "I have to know. I need to find out what happened to him." Mr. Daniels nodded reluctantly.
All recht, I'll show you what I know.
"But be warned, once you start digging, there's no turning back." Mr. Daniels took Sophie to a back room of the library, where old newspaper clippings and archived files were stored. After sifting through piles of dusty papers, he handed Sophie a folder labeled Biogen Tech Seizure Alert Dogs Program. Sophie opened the folder with trembling hands. The papers detailed a top-secret program that had been conducted under the guise of helping those with epilepsy. Biogen Tech had experimented with dogs, attempting to enhance their sensory abilities using experimental drugs. The program had been abandoned after reports of severe side effects, dogs becoming aggressive, losing their ability to function normally, or even dying. But there was one dog that had survived the trials longer than the others: Shadow. The most chilling part of the file was a section detailing the drug that had been used in the experiments. The drug was designed to increase the dog's ability to detect changes in brain activity, making them more attuned to the onset of seizures. But the drug had unpredictable side effects. It caused extreme sensitivity to sound, light, and even touch. Some dogs had become dangerously erratic, and many were put down after their behavioral changes became too extreme. Shadow had been the one to survive the longest, but the experiments had left their mark. His once sharp instincts had been twisted into something darker, and the dog had been abandoned, discarded like so many others. Sophie felt a wave of anger and sorrow rise within her. "They did this to him," she whispered, staring at the page. "They turned him into this, and then they just left him behind." That evening, as Sophie walked home with Shadow by her side, she noticed something unsettling. The same man from the auction, he was following her, keeping a distance, but making sure she could see him. Sophie's heart began to race, and she felt a cold sweat break out on the back of her neck. She quickly turned into the wooded area behind her house, hoping to lose him, but the man followed. Sophie picked up her pace, and Shadow, sensing her fear, growled softly. His body was tense, his eyes scanning the darkening woods. "Go," Sophie whispered urgently to Shadow. "We need to get home." As they ran, Sophie heard the man's footsteps behind them. He was getting closer.
Panik bubbled inside her.
She glanced over her shoulder, her breath coming in sharp gasps. Then, just as Sophie thought the man would catch up to them, a figure emerged from the trees. Noah, the former soldier who had known Sophie's father, stepped into view, blocking the man's path. "Stay back," Noah said, his voice low and threatening. He stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the man who had been trailing them.
"You don't want to mess with him, eh?"
The man hesitated, clearly calculating his options, before turning and retreating into the woods. Sophie, heart-pounding, rushed to Noah's side. "Who is he? What does he want?" Noah turned to face her, his expression grim. "I don't know, but it's not good. We need to figure out who he is, and why he's following you." Sophie, Noah, and her mother gathered that night to discuss what had happened. Noah had been in the military and had extensive experience in handling covert operations. He agreed to help Sophie uncover the truth about biogen tech, the drug experiments, and the people now after Shadow. "We'll get to the bottom of this," Noah assured them. "But we have to be careful. Whoever is after you, they're not just interested in Shadow. They're interested in covering up what they did to him." Sophie nodded, determined. "I'm not going to stop. I have to save him. He's been through too much already." The team began planning their next move, determined to uncover the truth and protect Shadow from the people who would stop at nothing to erase the past. The days following the confrontation with the mysterious man were filled with a mixture of fear and determination. Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that danger was closing in, but she knew one thing for certain: she couldn't back down. Shadow needed her, and she wasn't going to let anyone take him from her. She spent countless hours with Noah, formulating a plan to get answers and rescue Shadow if necessary. Noah had contacts from his time in the military, people who could help them navigate through the shadows of Biogen Tech's operations. It was clear now that Shadow wasn't just a victim of failed experiments, he was a key player in something far more dangerous. And it wasn't just Shadow that was at risk, Sophie had unknowingly become a target. That evening, after several tense days of planning and preparation, Noah stood by the barn door, his eyes scanning the perimeter. "We're doing this tonight. No more waiting," he said, his voice steady, but there was an edge to it. Sophie nodded, her resolve firm. "We'll get him back," Sophie said, the weight of her words settling over her like a protective cloak. Under the cover of darkness, Sophie, Noah, and Sarah drove to a remote area on the outskirts of town, where Biogen Tech's secret facility was located. The building was tucked away in a secluded industrial zone, surrounded by high fences and barbed wire. Sophie felt her stomach twist as they neared the facility, but she pushed her fear aside. There was no turning back now. "Noah, are you sure about this?" Sarah asked, her voice laced with concern as she looked out the window at the looming facility. "This place is a fortress." Noah glanced at her, his jaw clenched. "We don't have a choice. Shadow's in there, and we can't waste any more time." They parked the car a few hundred yards away from the facility and approached on foot, moving carefully through the shadows. Sophie could feel her heart pounding in her chest, each step heavier than the last. Shadow had already been through so much, and now it was up to her to rescue him from the people who had caused all his pain. As they neared the perimeter of the facility, Noah motioned for them to stop. He pulled out a small device from his pocket, which he used to disable the security system. "We've got about 10 minutes before the next security patrol passes," he whispered. "That's our window." Sophie nodded, her grip tightening on Shadow's collar. The dog, sensing her anxiety, let out a low growl but stayed by her side. The bond between them had only grown stronger over the last few days, and Sophie could feel his energy pulsing through her, giving her the courage she needed. They slipped through the security breach and found themselves inside the facility. The air was thick with the smell of antiseptic and cold metal. Sophie's footsteps echoed in the hallway as they crept through the dimly lit corridors, each corner a potential danger. They passed several rooms filled with equipment, strange machines, cages, and medical supplies, all signs of the twisted experiments that had taken place here. Finally, they reached the holding cells. Sophie's heart skipped a beat when she saw the familiar shape of Shadow in the corner of one of the cages. He was lying on the floor, his eyes wide and alert, but his body was visibly weakened. "Sophie," Noah whispered, his voice grim. "We're running out of time. We need to get him now." Sophie didn't hesitate. She moved toward the cage, and with trembling hands, she unlocked the door. As soon as the door swung open, Shadow stood up, his tail wagging weakly. His eyes locked onto Sophie's, and for a moment, the world seemed to fade away. She had done it. She had found him. But just as Sophie reached out to pet Shadow, a loud crash echoed from the hallway. Sophie's blood ran cold. "They're here," Noah muttered, grabbing Sophie by the arm. "We need to move now." The sound of footsteps grew louder, and within seconds, a group of security guards appeared in the hallway. They were heavily armed, their eyes scanning the area for any sign of intrusion. "Get down," Noah shouted, pulling Sophie to the ground just as the guards passed by. Sophie's heart raced as she crouched low to the floor, her breathing shallow. She could hear the guards talking, their voices growing closer. They were just a few feet away. "Stay quiet," Noah whispered, his hand resting on Sophie's arm. "We wait for the right moment." Sophie nodded, but she couldn't shake the fear that gripped her chest. What if they didn't make it out in time? What if Shadow was caught again? But then, as the guards moved further down the hallway, Noah gave the signal. "Now." They sprinted down the corridor, Shadow following closely behind. Sophie's legs burned as she ran, but there was no time to stop. They had to get out. Just as they reached the exit, alarms began blaring, and bright red lights flooded the hallway. The security guards had discovered the breach. "Hurry! We're almost there," Noah urged, as the sound of approaching footsteps grew louder. Sophie's breath caught in her throat as they reached the exit doors. Noah pulled out a small device and disabled the last security lock. The doors swung open just in time as they raced into the night. As they dashed through the woods, Sophie could hear the sounds of the facility's security team closing in. But just as all hope seemed lost, a car sped up beside them. It was a police cruiser, its lights flashing. "Get in," the officer shouted. "We've got you covered." Sophie, Noah, and Sarah scrambled into the car, with Shadow following them. The officer slammed the door shut and sped off, the police car racing away from the facility, just as the security guards reached the road. Sophie looked back at the facility, the place where Shadow had been trapped. It was behind them now, but she knew it wasn't over. The truth was still out there, and the people responsible for what happened to Shadow had to be stopped. "We did it," Sophie whispered, her eyes welling up with tears. "We got him." The night air was cool as Sophie sat in the back seat of the police cruiser, her body still trembling from the adrenaline of their escape. Shadow lay at her feet, his head resting against her leg. His breathing was steady now, and though he was still weak from everything he had endured, there was a sense of peace about him. Sophie's heart swelled as she gently petted his head. The weight of the last few days, of everything she had fought for, was finally beginning to sink in. "We did it, didn't we?" Sophie whispered, more to herself than anyone else. She glanced out the window, watching the dark landscape blur past. "We saved him." Her mother, Sarah, sat beside her, looking just as exhausted but relieved. She reached over and squeezed Sophie's hand. "You did more than that, Sophie. You gave him a chance. You gave us a chance." Noah, who was in the front seat, glanced back at them. "We all did. But Sophie, you were the one who wouldn't give up. You found him, and you didn't let anyone stop you." Sophie nodded, her eyes glistening. "I couldn't leave him behind, Noah. Not after everything he's been through." She glanced down at Shadow again, her heart full of emotion. "He's not just a dog. He's family." The police drove them to a nearby station, where they filed reports and gave statements about what had happened. It wasn't long before the authorities began investigating Biogen Tech and the illegal experiments that had taken place in their facility. Evidence of the company's unethical practices flooded the news, dozens of reports, some detailing animal cruelty, others uncovering financial corruption and medical malpractice. Sophie and her mother watched the news together the following evening, as footage of Biogen Tech's leaders being arrested was broadcast on television. The company's operations were shut down, and all the evidence that Sophie had uncovered was used to bring the responsible parties to justice. For the first time in what felt like forever, Sophie allowed herself to breathe. She had done it. She had uncovered the truth, freed Shadow, and brought down the people who had tried to exploit him.
Look, Mom, Sophie said, pointing to the screen.
They're getting what they deserve. They can't hurt anyone else now. Sarah smiled and wrapped an arm around her daughter. You did something incredible, Sophie. Your father would be so proud of you. Sophie's heart swelled with pride, but there was something else, something deeper. She wasn't just proud of what she had done for Shadow. She was proud of who she had become. In rescuing him, she had discovered a strength within herself she hadn't known existed. Over the next few weeks, Sophie and her mother turned their barn into a rehabilitation center for service dogs, inspired by the experience they had shared with Shadow. They received donations and support from local communities and animal rescue groups, who had heard about Sophie's bravery and Shadow's story. The barn, once a symbol of loss and grief, became a place of hope and healing. Shadow slowly recovered from his ordeal, though the experiments had changed him in ways that couldn't be undone. He would never be the same dog he had been before. But he was alive, and that was enough. His bond with Sophie grew stronger every day. It was clear that their connection went beyond anything Sophie had ever imagined. One evening, after a long day of work at the barn, Sophie sat with Shadow under the setting sun. She smiled as she watched him chase after a ball, his energy returning bit by bit. Shadow stopped, turning to Sophie, his eyes full of understanding. He ran over to her, nuzzling her hand. I'm so glad I found you, Sophie whispered, her voice thick with emotion. You're home now. Sophie's journey had been long and difficult, but it had taught her more than she could have ever expected. She had learned the power of perseverance, the importance of family, and the incredible bond between humans and animals. Through her fight for Shadow, she had found a new purpose, a purpose that wasn't just about rescuing dogs, but about giving them a second chance at life. Shadow, now fully recovered, became a symbol of the healing power of love. Sophie continued her father's legacy, training service dogs and helping them find their way into the lives of people who needed them most. The barn became a sanctuary for rescued dogs, a place where they could start fresh and find their forever homes. Sophie and her mother worked tirelessly to ensure that no dog ever went through what Shadow had endured. They helped dozens of dogs, providing them with the care, training, and love they deserved. And through it all, Shadow remained by Sophie's side, a constant reminder of everything they had fought for. Sophie glanced out over the field one last time before heading inside for the night. She could see Shadow in the distance, running freely, his tail wagging in the wind. She smiled, feeling a deep sense of peace. We did it, Dad, Sophie whispered, her voice barely audible. I finished what you started. And in that moment, Sophie knew that the legacy of her father, and the love he had for dogs, would live on through her and Shadow, in every life they touched. The journey had not only been about saving Shadow, it was about finding strength, purpose, and hope in the face of adversity. Through perseverance and compassion, Sophie had turned a tragedy into a triumph, proving that even the darkest moments could lead to light. She had discovered that family wasn't just about blood, it was about the bonds we create, the love we share, and the way we lift each other up. And sometimes, the greatest heroes are the ones who fight not for fame or fortune, but for those who cannot fight for themselves. This story illustrates the power of determination, love, and compassion in the face of adversity. It shows how a young girl's unyielding spirit and her bond with a dog lead to uncovering dark truths, taking down a corrupt organization, and giving both the dog and herself a second chance at life. It's a testament to the idea that love can heal, and even in the darkest times, there is hope for a better tomorrow. The story carries a powerful message about the importance of empathy, kindness, and standing up for those who cannot fight for themselves. It reminds us that every living being deserves compassion and a second chance, regardless of their past. Sophie's courage is a beacon of hope, showing that even small acts of kindness can make a big difference in the world. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this emotional journey. Please like this video, leave a comment, and share your feelings with us. Your engagement helps us continue creating more meaningful stories like this. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss out on upcoming inspiring stories that are sure to touch your heart. Every interaction you make encourages us to bring you even better content. A heartfelt thank you for watching this story. Your support means the world to us. Until next time, stay inspired and keep believing in the power of compassion and second chances. See you in the next video.